Sometimes you've been referred to in these magazines, some of which don't print the truth, as the quiet Beatle. Do you consider yourself quiet or an extrovert or just what?
No, not really. Usually, in fact, I've noticed myself at most press conferences over here, I am quiet. I just seem to sit there giggling because everybody go ask the same question. And so, whoever feels in the mood usually answers it. And, I am quiet, more quiet than the others at these press conferences and things, but in actual life, I wouldn't say so anyway. It's a rocking little record of what my job is to play. Roll over, Beethoven, gotta hit it again today. The so-called quiet one amongst the Beatles was George Harrison. George, actually, on the quiet, was a great womanizer. I would say that probably he had more notches on whatever he put them on than any of the other the other three Beatles, combined. He was a ladies' man in that respect. He always spoke sort of fairly quietly and therefore had this reputation for being quiet, but it was largely because when he spoke to you, he would come quite close up to you and speak to you, nose almost touching nose, and if you were watching this from across a room, you'd think that something highly confidential was being imparted over there by George. In fact, all George was probably doing was saying what a nice new guitar he'd bought himself, or how one of his guitar strings went last night, but he always had this habit of doing terribly close up and talking very confidentially to you. He was also the guy who remembered your name, not just your name, but the name of your girlfriend or your partner or whatever, and picked up the conversation from 2 weeks ago and would remind you of something you'd said to him, this kind of thing. He was interested. He was totally unlike the general public image of the sort of pop idol. In other words, he was interested in those around him and interested in listening as well as talking about himself.
I'm probably the biggest bore you've ever had on the show.
Really? You think?
Yeah.
Well, I'll be the judge of that. Listen, I'll tell you.
Well, I don't really, they asked me, do you want to come on the Dick Cavett show? And I said, yeah, I got nothing to talk about, really.
Yeah.
They said, well, think of something, anything. So I thought, okay, we'll go and talk about Raga, which is...
Film. You mean that's it? When we're done talking about that, then...
Then I go, yeah.
You don't like to talk, then?
Well, not really. Sometimes, if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
George Harrison is, one, a much better guitarist than people give him credit for, and two, a much better songwriter than people give him credit for. I think his playing and his guitar solos and his general ideas have really helped the Beatles a lot. I think that because he comes from a total guitarist point of view, whereas John and Paul come from a songwriter's point of view, he added a completely different slant to it, and I think he had a lot to do with the Beatles sound, a lot more than people give him credit for.
George used to say, I don't care what the chord's called, if it works, it works, And it's quite funny in a way, because Vivian used to be sort of really keen. He said, I've just learned how to play a B major's 13th, subtracted, suspended fourth. Call it Horace, call it anything, but if it works, And I once teased George once, I said, you really are lazy with your lyrics, something in the way she moves, and it's really nice, and you get to another bit, you can't think of anything, you just stick a bloody old guitar lick in. He went, yeah, but, oh, bugger, I've got,
Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Something in the way she woos me.
Lennon and McCartney, I think the world agrees, are two of the most outstanding songwriters of all time, and George Harrison came quite a good third there and would have had much more songwriting success in his own right if he hadn't been working in these enormous shadows of these enormous, gigantic Lennon and McCartney songwriting team.
All the Beatles needed was a bit of lead guitar lots of chords and support for the songs, and that's what George was able to provide. And of course he was George Harrison, Beatle, so you don't need a kind of brilliant session guitar player with that sort of a band. You need the personality, the person who is a Beatle. So that's what George was. He wasn't a brilliant guitar player, but he was certainly a support to the other guys.
You know I just can't jump it. Sometimes it gets so hard, you see. I'm just sitting here beating on my trumpet with all these promises you left for me.
I had a brilliant childhood, and George, who was one of my best friends, we just used to meet up like every weekend, and we'd go for cycle trips. You know, we'd go to Chester or somewhere with bottles of lemonade and all that silly sort of famous five life. You know. And I hadn't seen George for about 2 years or something like that. And so I said, "Oh, where are you going?" He said, "Litherland Town Hall. We're playing there tonight." So I said, "Oh, can I carry your guitar in?" Said, "Of course you can." Yeah. So I carried George's guitar in. And then was quite surprised to find that he was one of the Beatles with Paul and John, who I knew as well.
John had started the band. Paul had joined the band later, but became very much an integral part of it. And George, it mightn't seem a lot, but I think when you are 19, 20 and somebody's only 16, they're the little kid. And George had joined the band even younger than that, when he was about 14 years of age, and John was very reluctant to take him on because of his age. And I think in John and Paul's eyes, he was always seen as the little kid. Now, consequently, he didn't have the greatest singing voice, George, but he could write material and was a very, very talented man, but he would only get the statutory sort of obligatory 2 tracks, if he was lucky, on an album.
Love, love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Whoa, love me do. Love, love me do. You know true, so please, love me do, whoa, love me do.
The Beatles weren't the first Merseyside group to get to #1. That was Jerry and the Pacemakers. It happened very gradually. I mean, they'd made records in Germany backing a singer called Tony Sheridan. I mean, they were bad records, but they were records all the same. But the first sort of bona fide single was Love Me Do, which sort of crept into the sort of very edge of the top 20, largely because of the buzz from up north and scattered sort of spinnings on Radio Luxembourg.
That's like White Scouse R&B, a very simple song, but it's got a lot of Beatles in it. It really does. You can see how George Martin, to his fantastic credit, spotted there was something special there.
Love me do. Whoa, love me do.
I don't think George Martin considered it to be such a big hit, and he insisted that they do somebody else's numbers, and he made them do Mitch Murray's How Do You Do It, and they didn't like the idea of doing that, so they sort of played a lacklustre version which wasn't very good. and they'd wanted Please Please Me on the B-side. But George Martin said Please Please Me wasn't good enough, but he made some suggestions to make it far better. And when he had them recorded, he said, "You've just made the number one, you're number one." But in actual fact, they didn't, because the official music charts were done by Record Retailer, and the number one record was How Do You Do It by their stablemates Jerry and the Pacemakers, and the Beatles were number two with Please Please Me.
Please Please Me had enormous impact, just the way it raced into the song and the harmonies all the way through, and that howl of harmonica, which kind of introduced an older sound into alongside these younger voices, you know. And it was just all action and driving along, and this interesting descending line of the melody. Well, it captivated people, and I remember just starting to see them all over the papers right then.
Please Please Me, the Beatles song, was quite unusual and quite different from a lot of the recordings of that era, because George Harrison's role in the band was lead guitar, but not, as we know, as a rock god lead guitarist. You know, he was a supporting role to the vocals. And on that particular song, what they did was they doubled the vocals with the lead guitar, which is quite unusual. So I'll play it a couple of times to show you what he was doing. So that there, he was doubling the vocals that Lennon and McCartney were singing. And then the whole song goes on, so I'll play that from the top again, right through, okay?
It was incumbent upon the Beatles to present a different personality to the public. You know, the chemistry of them wasn't so much a group, you know, per se, as the four personalities within it. And on every album they made, there was always a focus on a different Beatle. On the first one, for example, George sang Do You Want to Know a Secret? I mean, he did it in a slightly embarrassed way. You know, he sang it in very sort of thick scouse. And, I mean, that was a track that was seized upon by another Liverpool act, Billy J. Kramer, and it sort of went to #1. And I think in purely commercial terms, that was a standout track.
Pre-Beatles, George used to do like novelty numbers, you know, I'm Henry VIII and the Sheik of Araby and the Bobby, you know, Take Good Care of My Baby, and it's sort of light-hearted pop songs as against the other guys' songs. And he was a far better guitarist than anybody credits him for at the time. And he's also he was also writing, but he wasn't prolific like the other two. The other two could just churn them out 10 minutes every 10 minutes. And, they could do it. You know. They could time each other to how long it was going to take. If it wasn't finished in half an hour, it was just thrown away and then start on another song. George used to take time and to fine-tune his songs and get them really, and then present them to the others. That's on the first few records he only had the odd first few songs.
I was up at the ABC Blackpool with him, and George said, "I want to thank you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You just earned me over 7,000 quid up to now." He said, "Because I was coming out one night and I thought you'd be hustling me to write a song, so I've written a song called Don't Bother Me." And that got him started on songwriting again. And of course, but he couldn't compete with Lennon and McCartney, not in the quality, but they wouldn't let him record. You know, they always put him down, and they wouldn't even help him. While Paul or George would help each other. If George asked John, "Can I have a bit of help?" Like that, they refused. They refused to help George, so he wrote in isolation himself, and it was coming out with really fantastic numbers.
You don't realize how much I need you. Love you all the time and never leave you. Please come on back to me. I'm lonely.
John and Paul hogged the albums, probably because they wrote the songs, you know. George would be given 2 songs usually, and Ringo 1.
Thing or two to tell me. How was I to know you would upset me? I didn't realize as I looked in your eyes. You told me, oh yes, you told me, you don't want my loving anymore. That's when it hurt me. I'm feeling like this, I just can't go on anymore.
The Rubber Soul album, I believe, was a groundbreaking album in as much that they're finally getting rid of the Mersey sound, and also the likeable mop tops are no longer with us. They're getting serious now. They're getting into heavy music. They're getting into serious music.
That era, they're really spiky, pungent songs with strange rhythms to them and dark implications.
Up until 1966, every time George Harrison came up with a song, everybody laughed at him. Particularly George Martin, the Beatles producer, who would always sort of pat him on the back, patronise him, and say, "Well, it's not bad, but go away and do something better." And I think John and Paul were also very, very cynical about their younger brother, as they would have seen him, because don't forget he's 3 years younger than John Lennon. Very cynical about the idea that he suddenly wanted to be a songwriter as well. In fact, in 65, he had already started to write interesting, unusual songs, and he had a very sort of cynical, open-eyed, realistic take on romance as well. And that came through in 66 with the 3 great songs he wrote for Revolver, where he really started to exert his influence on the band. Then the most important way in which he changed the Beatles' songwriting was by introducing the Indian influence. Not quite the first time it had been done on a pop record. The Yardbirds and maybe the Kinks had got there first. But as far as the outside world was concerned, he was the one who was leading the world into sort of Oriental mysticism and the whole sound of the sitar and the tabla and so on.
Recording star Vincent Bell warms up an instrument which is creating excitement in today's popular music world. It's an electric sitar invented and designed by Mr. Bell. It produces the new exotic Eastern sound first introduced by the Beatles.
George discovered Indian music, and that actually gave him quite a very pronounced leverage on you know, what they did in the studio, because nobody else understood Indian music the way George did. And when, you know, a sitar player turned up or a tabla player, it was George that actually gave orders rather than George Martin.
At least this sort of retreat from live shows meant that they could really get down to what they did best at this point, and that was concentrating on writing. So George Harrison as well could write great songs alongside John and Paul. And that led to all their blockbusting later period albums, which caused so much excitement and are still being mulled over and debated to this day.
It's quite striking that the first song on Revolver is a George Harrison song, Taxman. And okay, John, you always used to claim he wrote half of it and George should have given him the credit. But it is very much George. It's about money. It's about worrying about what was going to happen to him as a person if all the money ran out. And because the Beatles were paying, I think it was 98% of their income at that point to the inland revenue. And so, not surprisingly, it was a fairly major preoccupation, particularly for George, who already had the reputation of being the one member of the Beatles who was interested in the business affairs. But for the youngest member of the band and the one who had been treated as a joke, to suddenly have the lead track on the album was quite a breakthrough for George.
Do you ever wish that you could just go out and take a walk on the street or go somewhere like a normal human being?
Sometimes, but you see, our life isn't as hectic all the time. It's just on a tour like this. You see, if we do a show in England, well, it'll be wild, there'll be lots of people. But as soon as we finish the show and we get away, we all go home, and we can go out to these regular places we go where we don't get bothered. And I always drive around every day in my car, and people see me, and, you know, so there's George in his car, but, you know, that's okay. So every time we go on a tour, you know, we take it for granted that we're not going to get out, and we're not going to see anything other than the hotel, the car, the aeroplane, and the place we're playing. So, you know, we don't worry. I mean, we don't do a tour this is the longest tour we've done, actually, for quite a while, which is almost 5 weeks long. I mean, after this, we'll go back and have a couple of weeks off, and we'll be able to sit around and, you know, just go out in the evenings. So, if we did one tour right after another, then we'd definitely probably go off our heads, but, you know, we have it organised so that we don't.
If we're agreed that Beatlemania broke out for the first time in 1963, and as far as the Americans are concerned, I guess 1964, then in fact the Beatles worked as a touring band for a painfully short period of time, because by 1966, only 3 years later, it was the end of touring. They came off the stage forever. They never did another show.
George had got sick and tired of it. He was getting sick and frightened, and he didn't like playing on stage anymore. None of them liked having to keep on doing twist and shout all the time. There weren't any synthesizers, and you couldn't carry a bloody huge orchestra around with you, and sound systems only existed to hold 3 or 4 microphones. You couldn't multi-wire people or have direct inject sound systems in those days. So there was this impossibility of them performing these songs. So they got stuck onto the treadmill of doing everything, you know, from With the Beatles, Please Please Me, Hard Days and Nights, Help, whatever. No chance at all to perform Tomorrow Never Knows, for instance. Can you imagine if they tried to do that?
On the one hand, you'd got the actual artistic side of things, which meant something to each of them, but particularly to George Harrison, who was George was a very meticulous student of music more than anything else. He's the guy who would tune up not only his own guitar at the last minute, but tune up the other boys' instruments as well. Right up until the end, however, there was no statement from the Brian Epstein organisation at any stage to say that this was the end, that the touring was over. Brian absolutely confidently expected that he would manage to get his boys back on the stage. He had actually penciled out a UK tour that never did take place. But on the other hand, nor was there any official announcement at any stage to say the Beatles have now finished touring. They announced it, all right. They announced it to me on a one-to-one basis immediately after the final concert, which was in San Francisco at the end of August in '66. We all got back onto our charter aircraft to fly back down the Californian coast from San Francisco to Los Angeles, and George Harrison sank down into the seat next to me on the plane and said, "Well, that's it, I'm not a Beatle anymore." Now that would have been a sensational headline worldwide, except that he didn't actually mean that. What he meant was, I don't have to go through this Beatlemania thing anymore, the touring is over, we're not doing it anymore.
George, we've been hearing rumors and reading things about a woman who has been predicting a plane disaster. What do you think about these things? What are your personal thoughts about them?
Normally I just take it with a laugh and a smile and a pinch of salt and think, you know, she's off her head. But, you know, it's not a very nice thing to say, is it? Especially when we're flying almost every day. But, you know, just hope for the best, keep a stiff upper head, and away we go. You know, if you crash, you crash. Don't you? When your number's up, that's it.
Certainly the Sgt. Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour time invoke psychedelic times past, and for a certain type of person, when they hear Sgt. Pepper, they imagine using its cover as a convenient sort of working surface for rolling a joint. Then again, I mean, the Beatles at that time were very different, at least as far as the public perception was concerned, from the group that first emerged in 1963. You know, the mop-top Mersey marvels, the lovable scamps like, you know, Just Williams Outlaws.
Sgt. Pepper was too contrived, and it was natural that it should go that direction, because after they came off the road, all eyes were upon this first product of their studio era, and the Beatles were producing something not just for their thousands, millions of fans, but something, I guess, that they felt would be professionally strong enough to impress their own peers, i.e. the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, etc. So it wasn't so much for the fans as to make quite sure that the business, their rivals, their competitors, their colleagues in the music world knew what they were doing and could see and hear the progress they'd made.
The Beatles owed a film to United Artists. They were going to do 3 films, and they spoke for a while about doing a remake of an old western called A Talent for Loving, and then they mulled over the idea of doing a remake, of doing a film of Lord of the Rings. But in the end, it turned out they decided to actually have something very sort of formless. And the idea came originally when George visited Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, which was the storm centre of flower power.
People loved it. You know, the proper Beatle people loved it. It was just the critics at the time. But then, you know, the Beatles no longer had that protective wall of Brian around them. You know, they were open for, it was open season on them by then. If Brian had been there and had sort of presented it to as we used to sort of have little press parties and very good coterie of what are now tabloid writers who sort of hung on every word. There were no backstabbers in those days. Maybe if Brian had been alive, it would have been stage managed a bit better in its presentation to the public and the media.
really goes to show. And I told them where to go. Ask a policeman on the street.
With Blue Jay Way, George took the Indian musical influences that he'd used on the previous albums and actually managed to sculpt something quite beautiful out of it. Very, very simple beginning. He was actually sat on Blue Jay Way in, I think, Los Angeles one evening, waiting for his friend Derek Taylor to turn up, and Derek and his family got lost. And while he was there was a harmonium in the house, and he just sat down and started to make up this song about waiting for his friends on Blue Jay Way. And it's really quite a haunting melody. It's not really a song about anything apart from waiting, but it's got a strange sort of eerie beauty about it.
In the film, when you've got that fisheye lens fixed on him, and there's sort of all these images of George sort of singing it actually works far better. But it's one of these things where I think that's an example of something that really you need the visuals to sort of make it, you know, more palatable, I suppose, because all it's about is George waiting in some sort of dwelling in Los Angeles, waiting for some friends to turn up. That's all it is, you know, please don't be long, you know, looking at his watch. That's it. It's not really much of a song. But I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily a failing, because all those songs tend to hang together, not so much on the double EP, but on a vinyl album that was put out, I think, only in the States, which actually contains all those sort of songs from that period, Strawberry Fields to Penny Lane, and it certainly works in that sort of context.
You can look at Magical Mystery Tour, coming only a week or so after his death, as being escapist. It was the Beatles' essential escape route, if you like, from the horrors of the fact that somebody so close to them as Brian Epstein, so young, of their generation in fact, had died in front of their eyes almost, as it were, like this.
So the Beatles just wanted to get something, and particularly Paul wanted to get something done. So they just went off and did Magical Mystery Tour. Some of it was worked very well. You know, the musical bit sequences, the strip club thing with the Bonzo Dog Dude, lovely little vignettes of the time, and you know, that's like psychedelicness.
The cab was racing through the night. His eyes in the mirror keeping cutie in sight.
In the Magical Mystery Tour, we're the band that accompanies the Beatles when they arrive at the Raymond Revue bar, and it's pretty exciting in those days, you know, because we actually had a naked lady fronting the band.
It got quite relaxed at the end. I mean, I think John was wearing Viv's cap, or George was wearing Viv's cap or something, and well, we didn't. I think we did it in about one take, so it was kind of up and at 'em kind of thing. You got the impression it really was a Magical Mystery Tour when even they didn't know what the hell was going to happen next, you know.
Slipping, sliding down a Highway 31. The traffic lights changed from green to red. They tried to solve, but they both wound up dead.
I met George really on the Magical Mystery Tour, because before that they'd been sort of like sneaking off to see the Bonzos and things like that. And he was, Death Cab for Cutie ought to be a single. I said, oh, come on. He said, yeah, but I don't know. And then he kind of, he turned up a couple of gigs, and he came to a couple of things, and we sort of hit it off, really, you know, sort of laughing at the same sort of things. Because I think, well, you know, he wasn't show busy either, you know, I'm not show busy. But it's quite funny to sort of like see the ones who don't mean to be funny, you know, being funny.
George's flowering as a songwriter had a lot to do with the Beatles' final breakup. Although at the time, you know, when they made Revolver, when they made Sgt. Pepper, everybody was firing on all cylinders. And they had, because, you know, EMI, because they proved to be such a sound investment for EMI was allowing them limitless studio times, allowing them all sorts of facilities. They could hire horn sections, string sections, entire orchestras if they wanted, you know, in order to sort of create these sort of commercially viable masterpieces. You know, they're actually able to sort of command, you know, 1 million advance orders before an album had even been made, you know, let alone released.
On the first few records he only had the odd first few songs. It wasn't until the White Album, and George had written, because he'd had the time off, he'd had a year off really, that he had this big stack of songs, which also the other two had a big stack of songs, so it was, sorry, they won again. So George went ahead and did his as his solo album.
Do you think you might have been the most anxious of the four to get out? I get that impression from reading about it.
Maybe, yeah.
I wonder
it was
why.
very, well, because over the years, you know, I had such a lot of songs mounting up that I really wanted to do, but I only got my quota of 1 or 2 tunes per album. Mm-hmm. And that way I would have had to have recorded about 100 Beatle albums just to get out the tunes I had in 1965.
Were you held down by the other fellas?
Well, very subtly, yes.
Yeah? How would they do it?
Really,
I mean,
they didn't strap me down or anything like that.
Yeah.
But no, it was just the way things happened, you know. It started off, I didn't write, they wrote, then I started to write, and it was sort of trying to push in a bit.
While My Guitar Gently Weeps was a bit of a revelation, really, because George had always been overlooked as a songwriter. And I think he probably felt that rather keenly. I think there was a little bit of resentment, perhaps you could see in his eyes, that all the focus of attention was on Lennon and McCartney, even if they wrote separately, let alone, you know, they didn't always write together, as we know. But so George probably felt a bit left out, but when he did come up with a song, it was always rather spectacular, really. I always liked My Guitar Gently Weeps, and of course he worked with Eric Clapton on that, his great hero and friend. I mean, George did admire other guitar players. He was very much in awe of guys that could really cut it as lead guitar players. So, but this isn't a guitar epic as such. It's a very beautiful song, and I guess it reflects George's role in the Beatles, really.
While My Guitar Gently Weeps is played like this. C minor is the first chord, and then he holds on to the C minor and he puts a B flat root. And then he does the same C minor but with an A root. And then it becomes an A flat major 7th. Then he plays C minor to B flat major, to F major, to G major. And then he does the whole thing again, so C minor, then a C minor with a B flat root, C minor with an A root, an A flat major 7th, and then a C minor to a B flat major, to an E flat major, to a G major, to a C into the chorus. They all did this, but George especially, he would either have a song starting in a minor key and he'd go to a major key for the chorus, or starting in a major key and going to a minor key. And on this track as well, he has his buddy Eric Clapton playing guitar on the White Album. And it's a fantastic, it's a very dramatic piece of music.
While My Guitar Gently Weeps was one of the landmark compositions for George Harrison, but don't forget he did something, and he did a load of other songs as well. So I do think that saying that he was his greatest composition while with the Beatles is not really fair. It was a fantastic composition and it was a brilliant song, but as it's saying it's the greatest competition with the Beatles, a lot of people will argue with that. I think it's a great song, brilliantly executed and beautifully played.
They demoed all those songs for the White Album when they were all ready to go. Yeah, the Beatles had even done some sort of, they'd actually played, they all got together down at George's house for a few days and sort of ran through all the songs, all the possible songs. He had them all there, but he recorded them beautifully with a big band and lots of star players, and he loved it. Very proud of it.
At the end of '68, they had this fantastically long mixing sessions for the White Album, after which they went off in different directions, and George went off to America and hung out with the band and with Bob Dylan. And I think for the first time in his life he felt as if he was being treated as a musical equal rather than a junior partner. And so he came back on January the 1st, 1969. The Beatles were supposed to be at Twickenham Film Studios to make a record and to prepare for a concert and a documentary film. And suddenly he's back into the old thing where he's got Paul telling him what to do. And he's just been out with Bob Dylan in America, who's been writing songs with him. And suddenly he's got this guy, Paul McCartney from Liverpool, in the year older at school than he was, still telling him what to do. And so he walks out of the Beatles. And for about a week it looks as if the Beatles are actually over. And John, Paul and Ringo are in the studio going, well, now what do we do? They've got Yoko there, they're jamming with her. They're making sarcastic comments about George, but they just don't know what to do with themselves. And finally they have to have a big summit meeting, and George comes back and they manage to stagger on till the end of the Let It Be project.
The group had problems long before Yoko came along. Many problems, folks.
Can you remember who was the first to say, you know, I bet we'll break up one day, that this won't go on, that this is sort of a dream, that we can't all stick together?
I don't really remember anything about the Beatle days. It seems like a sort of, previous incarnation when I think about it.
Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Something in the way she woos me. I don't want to leave her now. You know I believe in how.
There's been some suggestions that Paul and John were beginning to run out of steam towards the end of their career, their writing career together, reflected in albums like Abbey Road, which actually gave George a chance to shine more.
When Harrison got it right, he got it so right, because some of his songs that are here, like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun, are terrific songs, which, every bit as good as the classic Lennon and McCartney songs. Something which perhaps a lot of people remember the Shirley Bassey version, but it can be done either as a big kind of arm-waving ballad, or it can be done very subtly and beautifully. It's a tremendous kind of, just really moving and yearning love song.
Something in her style that shows me. Don't want to leave her now. You know I believe in how.
The first Beatles A-side, and the only A-side George ever done, right, is Something. And Frank Sinatra said it's the greatest love song of the 20th century. And of course, John admitted that the best numbers on Abbey Road were George's. And he'd written so much stuff while he was with the Beatles that when he came out with a solo album, All Things Must Pass, it was a triple album because they had so much material that he couldn't get on the Beatles albums.
I don't regret really anything, I mean, that's what happened, and it was good, it was good, but it was also good to carry on and do something else. In fact, it was a relief.
Sometimes they say
some people can't understand that, because Beatles was such a big deal. They can't understand why we should actually enjoy splitting up. But there's a time, you know, there's a time when people grow up and they leave home or whatever they do, and they go for a change, you know, and it was really time for a change.
The interesting thing is that when the Beatles disbanded, George really, I think, came into his own with his own work, right through to the end of his life, you know, the stuff he was doing. But when he was with the Beatles, I do think he was seen as sort of the young one. And the story has it, when John Lennon was courting, going out with Cynthia Lennon, George used to hang around them like a little poodle, like a little lad, you know, following him around sorts of stuff, because he was too young to go into the pubs they were going in. And so Cynthia used to get quite annoyed with the things. So, he's here again, you know, sort of thing. And he had this image for years and years and years. And I think he resented it, because you get the classic thing, don't you, when they're filming, I think it's Let It Be, near the end. And I think he put up with it for a long, long time. These sort of, if you like, put-downs, and he blows his top actually in one of the albums, unless when they're doing a recording, and has a go at Paul and says something like, you know, oh well, you know, that's the way you want to do it, we'll do it your way, sort of. And the worm has turned now, you know. George came into his own as he got older. If the split of the Beatles was well timed, sort of flukily for anyone, it was for Harrison, who was just coming to his best strength as a songwriter. Songs like Something are standards now, and so he came to his own solo career sort of with full confidence, really. His hippie Buddhist tendencies tended to overshadow perhaps the actual songs, and My Sweet Lord was where his hippie tendencies and his songwriting tendencies merged to the full. But that gave him a massive number one, meant that he survived the Beatles and came back strong with the number one single.
You hear some great guitar sounds all over those albums, and they really are good. And he was one true Western musicians that took to the sitar and actually studied it for 30 or 40 years and did it bloody properly. When everyone else played at it, he did it properly. And although he didn't use a sitar all the time, it just showed you the quality of the man's approach to anything he picked up. And I think that is just a hallmark of him as a musician.
The indie music really got popular during that 66, 67, you know, all the psychedelic period. And I think from that, most people have started to associate it with drugs, because the hippies, apart from the classical people who used to go and watch the music anyway, like the hippie people at that time were the ones who caught on to indie music, and it just happens that most of them were, you know, smoking pot or something.
Stig, meanwhile, had fallen under the influence of Arthur Sultan, the Surrey mystic, and Sultan had introduced Stig to his Ouija board work. Arthur Sultan now invited the Rutles on a get-away-from-it-all table-tapping weekend near Bognor. As usual, the press followed.
The Rutles wouldn't have been anywhere near as kind of authentic or as funny even without George's input. I mean, George was the one who persuaded Mick Jagger to come along, and Paul Simon, just to come along and tell the stories, just change the names. And you know, he was instrumental in asking Apple, or telling Apple, you know, so we need some footage to cut in with this, and so they obliged. And Gary Weiss was a genius in the labs, overseeing the footage we'd been lent and to match our footage with, you know, so it's, you know, technically, you know, well done. And he was pretty much always there. He was in it, you know. He was playing, you know, the interviewer, you know, when Michael Palin was doing a kind of Derek Taylor, Eric Manchester.
There have been continued allegations that Rutles Corps is going bankrupt. Eric Manchester, the Rutles press agent, are these allegations true?
No, they're conjecture, you know. They're sort of rumour. I think you find that where you get success, you'll always find this sort of rumour. No.
So the stories of the thefts, they're not true also?
No, they're greatly exaggerated, greatly exaggerated. It's bad, you know. Things are going. but nothing like the rate that people indicate. The trouble is that people feel that because these boys are the Rutles, people can come in and just help themselves to whatever they want, and this is just not on. And we're putting a stop to this, and we are doing, you know, it's almost dried up.
So he really wanted it made. I think of all the Beatles, you know, he was the one that realised they had to put the suits in the cupboard and move on.
By the time George died, he was tidying up bits and pieces. You know, they'd done the free as a bird stuff, those things. He was remastering because of the wonders of CD and all those new things. He was remastering all his stuff and the Wilbury stuff to bring out on CD. There's a big demand for it. It also put together, he was putting together an album which his son finished off with Jeff Lynne. I mean, he left an unfinished job. He was enjoying being George the gardener and the father, I think, and the racing driver and all those things. I mean, George used to be, he actually did shuffle around the world a lot. He had his place in Hawaii and his place in Australia and his place in England, and he went to all the Grand Prix, and he was non-stop at it, enjoying himself.
George was always, you know, saying things like that. You know, it's fine to have ambition and want success, but you still, even when you get those things, you still got to live with yourself and wonder what it's all about and things like that. And George did it sincerely and with a sense of humour, you know, and golly, we do miss him. We miss him, but we'll never forget him. You know, he's still here. He's still here.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.